Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Among the Ancients 2, a close readings podcast from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones and I'm joined as ever by Emily Wilson. Today we're talking about Plato's Symposium, his philosophical dialogue on love, or eros, that was probably composed sometime in the 380s or 370s BC, but is set many years earlier in 416. So Plato, of course, Emily, isn't himself one of the characters in the Symposium, is he? I mean, he doesn't appear personally in any of his dialogues, does he? Though,
no, he doesn't appear personally, and he doesn't appear personally in general in his dialogues. But his dialogues tend to be focused on the figure of Socrates, whom, of course, Plato knew, who was his teacher, and the whole Socratic circle, who are people who were well known personally to Plato in his youth. So they're real historical figures, but put in this historical but presumably fictionalized setting.
And of course, was it the Symposium? If it took place in 416 BC, Plato would have been, sort of 11 or 12 years old at the time.
He's too young to have actually shown up at an adult male drinking party. Yes, exactly. So it's a lot of the premise of the dialogue of this is hearsay, this is an anecdote told to someone else. It's also framed around this is something that Plato himself could only have access to through oral storytelling.
Plato, what do we know about Plato's life? I mean, more than some of the people that we've talked about in these podcasts.
Right. I mean, we know quite a lot about Plato's life if we think that the seventh letter is really by Plato. So he was born probably around 427 BC. He was from an aristocratic family. His uncle was named Critias and was involved in various revolutionary movements in the Athenian democracy, against the Athenian democracy. He became a follower of Socrates, and after Socrates' death, he developed his own school based on the teachings of Socrates, but developed in his own unique ways, called the Academy. We also know from the seventh letter that he tried very hard to convert the various rulers of tyrannical Sicily to his model of being a philosopher king, as he outlines in the Republic, without much success. The tyrants of Sicily didn't actually want to be philosopher kings, but Plato tried very hard to make them into philosopher kings.
And Socrates, I mean, a lot of what we know about Socrates, or think we know about Socrates, comes from Plato and Xenophon. Of course, Aristophanes, who's a character in the Symposium, but Socrates is also a character in Aristophanes' play The Clouds, which we talked about in the first series. So I suppose one sense you get from this is that it does make Athens seem quite small.
Everyone knows each other. I mean, at least the elite intellectual guys who go to the same drinking parties every night. It's a very tiny world, and everyone knows Socrates personally, and they're all buddies together, and they know, where is this person going to be drinking? At whose house are we going to go to hang out tonight? It's the friends who sort of go to the same bar every night, kind of vibe to it. Yeah, it's a very small world. And as you say, we have a lot of, the sources that we have on Socrates include, of course, almost the complete works of Plato, because Socrates is a character in almost everything that Plato wrote. We also have the Memorabilia and Apology of Socrates by Xenophon, and we also have the comedy on Socrates as an idiotic sophist in Aristophanes' Clouds.
And Socrates, he was obviously older than Plato. I mean, he died in 399. Famously, he was sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens and made to drink hemlock. And he'd have been in his early 70s by then. So he was a generation or even 2 generations older than Plato.
Exactly, yes. So he was, he says in Plato's Apology that he's 70 years old and his execution happened in, as you say, in 399. So we have pretty secure dates for Socrates, given that he's 70 and 399. So he was already relatively elderly by the time he was teaching Plato. So Plato knew him only at the sort of very end stage of his life. So in a way that he's sort of doing an imaginative exercise of what was it like to meet and flirt and drink with his teacher when the teacher was younger than Plato ever knew him as.
So in 416, when the Symposium takes place, Socrates would have been in his mid-50s. Several of the other guests were a bit younger than that. And as you said, they're historical figures.
They're all historical figures, exactly, yes. Yeah, which really matters, I think, yes. They're fictionalized. Presumably then that they didn't. This literal speeches. There was no tape recorder at the time. It wasn't like it's actual transcriptions of what somebody said. But they're all historical characters. And I think that really matters for understanding the dialogue, especially given that it's set in this very loaded historical moment, which is not just celebrating a very particular tragic competition, but also it's the year before the Sicilian expedition. It's sort of this weight of foreboding where we as readers are assumed to know what's going to happen next to these characters, but they don't know.
So, I mean, it has some of the force of a historical drama in that sense. So we should talk a bit about this moment in Athenian history. So it was during the Peloponnesian War or during the truce in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. So it was peace, but it wasn't really...
It was uneasy peace, yes. It was a holding off for a little while, but not like there was actually a sort of permanent settlement between the two big powers. Yes. And then the following year, as we've sort of suggested, hostilities were breaking out again, and there was this proposal to make a massive naval expedition to Sicily, advocated by one of the characters in the dialogue, Alcibiades.
So I'm trying to think what an equivalent now would be to... I mean, is it, as it were, setting something in 1938, or is it a...
Exactly. So there's a sense of this is on the eve of something momentous and potentially disastrous about to happen. So it's like setting it in 1938 or on the eve of the First World War, but then there's also a sense of this dialogue takes place on the eve of the Sicilian expedition, but then there's also an awareness that any reader of this dialogue in the 4th century is aware not just of the Sicilian expedition, which was disastrous for Athens, and not just that Athens will eventually lose the Peloponnesian War to Sparta and will the power and economic privilege and cultural privilege that Athens has at this wonderful moment. This is the apex and it's all downhill from there. But also that Alcibiades will be disgraced, he'll eventually be assassinated, and different things will happen to each of the characters in this text, including Socrates, who will be, as you said already, forced to drink the hemlock in 399. And so I think there's also a sort of grappling with and a sense of the Athenians in the wake of the Sicilian expedition took the wrong lessons from what happened there. They thought what's going wrong with our society is that people like Socrates are corrupting the youth with these terrible drinking parties, and that maybe the problem with Alcibiades wasn't necessarily just Alcibiades, but that he was hanging out with Socrates, who corrupted him and who corrupted so many of these lovely, upstanding young men that we're seeing here drinking. And the text is showing us it's not Socrates who's the problem, and it's actually not the drinking party that's the problem. It's a whole lot of other things that might be the problem.
And I don't know if we should maybe say a bit about what the Sicilian expedition was and what Athens was hoping to achieve by it. So Sicily, and Syracuse in particular, was allied with Sparta. Was it sort of a colony of Corinth, as it were, or was it was an independent city-state, but it was on the side of Sparta?
It was independent, but it was on the side, right? I mean, it wasn't completely... I mean, some of the states that were allied with Sparta were really sort of subject to Sparta, and same for Athens. But the Sicilian powers had so much wealth and privilege and military force of their own that it was a bit of a different situation. And so Athens thought by taking out Sicily, we can establish this dominance in the war. And they thought that their navy was good enough that it would work.
But, ...
But it did not work at all. It was a disaster. And it was a disaster where, historians, both ancient and modern, sort of wrestle with what exactly went wrong. I mean, one of the things that, at least in the ancient accounts, is presented as having gone wrong is that in the ancient accounts, one of the things that went wrong is that the whole thing was cursed from the start because there was an act of sacrilegious vandalism on the eve of the expedition where all the sacred herms, these phallic statues in the city of Athens, which are supposed to keep boundaries safe, and Hermes, of course, is the god of travelers. So right before an expedition, you don't want to alienate Hermes or destroy the herms. But all the homes in the city were vandalized, and it was reputed that it was done by Alcibiades and his buddies, including Euximachus and Phaedrus, who appear in this dialogue. And then he was tried later for the desecration of the Herms and various sort of imputations of blame against Alcibiades, who was thought to be plotting against the democratic government of the city and also bitter because he didn't get chosen as the general to lead the Sicilian expedition. And a much less charismatic guy, Nicias, got chosen, and that also is sort of part of the sort of problem with the expedition. May have also been about maybe it would have gone right if only Alcibiades had led it. Or else maybe it was doomed from the start. A whole lot of Athenian men who'd set off all hopeful in their ships either were killed or enslaved and ended up labouring away in the mines for the Sicilian tyrant.
But before all that happened, so the year before, just before, and there's a truce of a sort between Athens and Sparta. These aristocratic men have got together at the house of one of their number, of Agathon. His first tragedy has won first prize at the Dionysia, and he's got all his friends round to his house to celebrate his triumph. To celebrate his triumph.
And I think maybe it's important to also recognise that it's the second night of partying that we're getting in this conversation. So that also helps to explain why is there this odd rule where in most drinking parties, part of the point is drinking a lot. But in this one, they set a rule to start with that they won't do what is typically done of having somebody be the master of ceremonies and ensure that everyone drinks a great deal. They're going to instead be moderate. And the concept of moderation, or sophrosyne, which is an opposite or is related to eros as well as to other kinds of desires like desire to drink or the desire for sex, is also woven into the thematics of the text.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Among the Ancients 2, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, including Series 1 of Among the Ancients, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.